Hello and welcome to My Child is Academically Advanced. Now what? I am Stacy Johnson. I'm CTY's Marketing Coordinator here at Johns Hopkins. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Amy Shelton. She is the Executive Director at CTY. Dr. Shelton holds a faculty appointment in the School of Education and has held joint appointments at the School of Medicine and Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, and has served on the University Steering Committee for the Science of Learning Institute. She is an advocate for bright students in every community and has dedicated her research to the design and delivery of innovative educational models and approaches that support the diverse community of advanced learners. Amy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stacy, and welcome everyone. It's a lot of fun to talk about this kind of work. We do this day in and day out, so being able to share what we're learning in the literature and what we learn in our programs is very valuable. And tonight I want to talk kind of at the level of what we do as parents and educators for our kids. And so I'm going to start right off the bat with the reason we come to this topic is that it's very exciting to learn that your child has certain abilities or has done really well. Like we do like to hear when we've done well, when our children have done well, but can also introduce a question of, so what do I do now? What do I do with this information and how do I move? And that's what we're going to talk about. And I'm going to start by putting it in context. And the context I typically use is, what is our goal? What are we trying to do? And when we talk about the goal of education, we get these great statements that are very long-term, like preparing students for future success. The second one here, promote student achievement. That's actually from the Department of Education. But when we talk about day to day, what are we trying to do? It actually comes down to something that in our philosophy is quite simple. And that is, you start with making sure every child learns something new every day. And that sounds like, oh, how do I do that? Well, learning is happening all the time. And so what we do is we have to actually think about how this plays out. And when it comes to advanced learners, there's this really interesting phenomenon. So if we think about most educational systems, at the roughest level, we tend to think about who's doing okay and who's not, who's fine, who's not fine. And in many cases, what we sort of say is students who are kind of below where we expect them to be, in the formal terms, below proficiency, but just in general, they're below where we hope they would be performing. We tend to think those are not fine. And then if they're performing at or above where we expect them to be for their age or for their grade, then we think they're fine. But let's take for a moment, imagine that this student here is actually an advanced learner. And we've done webinars in the past and have some resources on sort of what those characteristics are. But this is someone who is able to get to a deeper place of thinking faster, sort of has a deeper sense of their own learning. Well, this is probably a student that is typically going to be under-challenged. And being under-challenged presents us with a challenge. So what is the challenge of the under-challenged student? Well, let me start off by saying, I think that one of the greatest sort of most common things you hear is that these students are going to be fine. And I'm going to say, you know what? It is actually true that an under-challenged student may find their own way. They may, because they're often driven by curiosity. In the world we live in right now, they can sometimes find their own learning. So there is a chance that a very advanced learner in sort of a typical setting where they're not being treated could do okay. But this is heavily dependent on resources and on certain social and emotional traits. And in past webinars, which as Stacy mentioned, can often be found on our YouTube site, these students aren't necessarily all the same when it comes to those social emotional traits like motivation and self-regulation, some of those things that might drive them to do their own learning. So what that means, and what we think about most often, is that these under-challenged students may also lose interest and severely underachieve. This is actually a common phenomenon. Someone who you learn later on that there was a time when they were probably in this advanced category, but are no longer showing it. They might act out. It's very common to see a bored student become a problem student and start to see behavioral issues. So these are not uncommon outcomes for an under-challenged student. The one that scares us the most is that these students can also coast along and appear okay, meaning that they do okay in school. We don't notice that they're necessarily underachieving, but if they're not getting that learning at the level they need it every day, they probably are, and they're not likely then to keep advancing and really reach the levels they could. So this particular piece of it is probably the one that will most commonly fly under our radar, and which is why we do what we do. So again, it takes us back to this point that we really want to make sure that every child learns something new every day and that they're being met where they are. So that's just to say that this student who is under challenge, we may think of them as fine in the category of where they are in school, but they're probably not fine with respect to their long-term learning and really thriving. So what do? Well, we start to seek solutions. And so the first set of solutions I'm going to really almost gloss over, but they are important. That is, there's some very obvious steps that people should take once you know about them. And that is, if you found out that your child is in this advanced category, whether your school uses the labels gifted, advanced, gifted and talented, whatever that might be, or if you've come to CTY and we've said, yes, your child is in this CTY or advanced CTY level, it's really important that you find out what's available to you. And this can be finding out what's available through your school, through your district. Some districts and states now have students who are in these categories get individualized learning plans. Many schools have push-in or pull-out programs, meaning that they either bring the differentiation to the classroom or they pull them out and offer them services. Finding the lay of that land is really important. The second is to educate yourself, doing things like coming to webinars like this one. And in there, really understanding that this is really about student needs. It's wonderful to celebrate achievements, but this is a really need-based approach. And starting to know those common myths, like the common myth that all of these students will be okay without any help. And there's many more. And again, we have webinars on this both now and in the future to talk about some of these things. And then, of course, considering things like out-of-school programs. So CTY and others offer in-person and online programs to support these students beyond the classroom. And those, for many students, are a way of kind of supplementing and advancing if the typical classroom is, on average, going to be under-challenging to them. So those are sort of the big picture ones that are about what you do with your schools and your community. What we actually want to talk about tonight is what else you can do for and with your child once you know that they are in this category. And so I'm going to break this down into a set of tips and a set of tools, and we're going to start with the tips. And there are 5 of them. Here's the overview. I'm going to go into a little more detail on each one. Each of these could actually be a webinar on their own. There's a lot to talk about and a lot of literature, but I'll give you kind of the short form of it, and we can answer more things in the questions. So the first one is foster curiosity. And that this all sounds a little bit like common sense, but I know for me, when I first started looking into why we do these things, it wasn't always obvious exactly how you think about this. In a typical school system, we worry often that kids come to us very curious, but the structure and nature of the way we must deliver certain standards and certain content may actually hamper their curiosity a little bit. And so it's really on educators and teachers of these students to think about how we foster curiosity. And there are some simple ways, some simple tips around this, like listening for clues to interests. These can be projects or topics in school that seem to really be grabbing a child's interest. It can be ideas from the media. What are they talking about? What are they hearing about? When you're out having experiences, what kinds of things are grabbing their attention or causing them to ask questions? And then it's our job as parents and educators to really ask questions. So as a caregiver of these students, what kinds of things, what's piquing their interest and what can you ask them about them, and encouraging them to follow up on those interests, getting them to think about it. So a very simple example, when we think about this, these children are very natural explorers. So what does it mean to explore the world? And so I'm going to give a very straightforward example. I had a friend years back who said to me she was very frustrated because she was certain her son was very bright, but he was only interested in sports. And instead of asking about school, he's always asking how the Orioles are doing. Well, that's actually an opportunity. That's an opportunity to say this is something that interests the child rather than just answering them. And this year we'd be saying we're doing pretty well. A few years back, we would have said we're in last place. But it's a chance to say, well, how would you know? How would you know how they're doing? What do we want to know? Do you want to know how much they're winning? Who are they playing against? Things like that. So you can use it as an opportunity to kind of get the child to explore. So in this case, it's pretty easy to find this information. In the case I was talking to, she didn't know much about baseball, so it was really helpful to actually talk through the places you could find the information. But it's a way to sort of just engage the information. It doesn't have to be a school topic. It can be anything. The second tip is one that we hear a lot about, which is to allow for failure. And we hear this all the time. Oh, make sure you learn from your failures. And there's a good reason for that. Instant success limits the learning of complex concepts. And the best way to think about this is that really learning is kind of an engineering design situation, and especially for complex concepts. And mistakes have the ability to show us why. So just again, to provide a concrete example, when I'm trying to build a paper airplane, I have a fondness for airplanes in general. If I want to build an airplane and I'm aiming for one that looks a little bit like, say, an F-14, and I make one and it flies perfectly, what I know at that point is that I did it right, but I don't necessarily know why I did it right. Now, let's say instead, my first one, I realize that it's like it's taking a nosedive right away, or it's not gliding evenly. Well, then I can start making different variations and I can change things. I can change the way the wings look. I can add additional folds. I can decide whether the center fold is facing up or facing down. So you can do lots of different things. And that means that ultimately, when I get one that flies the way I want it to, I don't just know that I've done it right and it's working. I know what things I've changed. I've learned something in the process. So that's sort of the very concrete, simple example of failure actually teaches us much more than success does in these cases. Now, saying that, there's something we know from the literature, and that is you have to learn from failure. And this is particularly true for high-end learners because failure hits our egos, meaning that it's actually hard to learn from a failure when you're not feeling good about yourself. And so there are techniques and tools for teaching how to learn from failure. But the most salient thing we can do as parents and educators is really give that permission to fail to ourselves as well as to our students, helping them to understand that failure is part of a process of learning. That can be very hard to do in certain school settings where everything you do is contributing to a grade and we're concerned about a grade. But there are many ways to sort of manage this in the sort of smaller scale and real world space. More and more educational systems are acknowledging this and actually building it into the way they're thinking about assessment of students, which will help us get to that place of deeper and stronger learning. But that permission to fail is really important, provided that you do not allow them to give up. So failure as part of the process is actually really important, but you cannot allow it to be the end point. The third tip is a fun one for parents and educators, which is be a student. So it can be intimidating sometimes, especially in the current environment where students have a lot of information, on hand. But if you can be a student and learn both alongside your student and from your student, you can go a much longer way. So just again, coming back to our Orioles example, as I said, the parent I was talking to was not very familiar with the statistics around baseball. And these are sort of the simplest statistics that you tend to see for teams. So, the encouragement here would be to actually look at those stats and say, what do they actually mean? What is this PCT? What's that about? Well, it looks like the ranking of the teams, sort of the order in which they're currently being ranked is dependent on that. It looks like it might be related to how many wins they have. And you can start asking questions about where it comes from. In this case, I would use this as sort of a springboard for playing with the math and say, well, it looks like it's actually the percentage of wins. So we can calculate that. Well, how would you calculate a percentage of wins? You need to know how many games. And then you can play with the numbers that are here and see if you can arrive at the correct answer. And lo and behold, when we actually calculate out the number of wins over the total number of games they've played, we get that percentage. So again, just a simple way of saying, like, if you don't know, that's okay. You don't have to be an expert to encourage your student. And sometimes you'll find your student actually does know. Your child may know this already. And this is a case where we say that's really important for parents and educators to learn to say, I don't know. One of the most powerful moments, I think, for many graduate students is when they're in a course with a very high-end expert instructor, and the instructor says, I don't know the answer to that. It's very powerful to recognize that we don't know everything. And some of them are because we haven't learned it yet in the world, and other times it's because you can only be an expert in so many things. So to really support your student, you don't need to be an expert. You just need to be willing to learn with them and to help support their learning. The fourth tip is to talk to other families. One thing we have learned over many, many years at CTY is that the greatest power is in the community that we build. And by talking to other parents and caregivers, to others who have students in the space, you can find out what they've found. You can share experiences. We always say when you're trying to figure out what to do with a child, say for a summer, finding a family that's just a little bit older has children a little bit older than yours can be extremely powerful to see what they found. what they liked and didn't like. Not all students are the same. So just because it works for one family does not mean it will work for yours, but that's a way of learning about it. So the other thing it does beyond building resources is it creates support networks. So as I said, it can be a little daunting sometimes when you know that the pressure's on to meet the needs of the student, right? That's how we always feel as educators, pressure's on. Not really. We love working with students. It's not as high pressure as it seems. But it is important that we stay attentive to it, and creating support networks for it are really important. So I provided here the QR code that links you to the C2I parent webpage, because we do have a very robust Facebook parent page where parents are very happy to share their opinions, good, bad, and otherwise, on the things they're finding for their children. There's often just really interesting posts there more broadly about the field and what's happening. Lots of great educational resources and lots of great communication and conversation. And the key to this one is that you're not alone, that having a student in this space, having a student of any kind, having a child is challenging. When you're trying to meet their needs and they're not the central focus of sort of the school district putting their attention to their needs or the school being able to, it can be a little daunting, and you're not alone. You can talk to other families. And then the fifth tip is one that I always get a lot of grumbling about, which is embrace the internet. It's here. It's been here for a long time. We're probably going to have a new slide next year that says embrace AI, because it's here to stay. With respect to the internet, the concerns around screen time are very real. And there's actually been new recent studies showing that we do really need to think about how kids are on their screens. There are some dangers both in their attention span and sort of the psychological tools, but also just physical impact of being on phones. So it is very real. That's not meant to be scary and say we must take all phones away. It's just that we need to be really conscious of it, because our children are using devices. They're using them in school, and we're leveraging them very well. But the key is that this is a place where access to content has never been so easy, and it requires sort of cultivating it. So what we're finding is for both parents and students, if you can embrace it and really think about it as a place for resources and really check sort of what those sources are. In places like CTY, we actually try to vet some of these materials. It can be it can be a very powerful way to motivate a student, to help them along. There is no doubt we need to get kids off their screens more often than we do, but it also is a tool that is very real and very powerful in what's available to us out there. So it's really the key is finding ways to make screen time valuable. And some of that is just learning what's available and encouraging things, which will come up again when we talk a little about some of the tools. So those are the 5 tips. I'm going to move now to the 5 tools. So these are similar, except they're a little more sort of how-tos than the tips. The tips are kind of things to think about. This is a little bit more on the how-to side. And I'm going to start with the first tool is actually the students themselves. So I say that because oftentimes I'm thinking about parents having to go out and find things. Students are actually very, very good at finding some of these opportunities. They just need help understanding what to do with it. And so we talked about listening for curiosity. It's also allowing your child to sort of bring school home in a way that's not about the homework, allowing them to show and help you understand things that they've learned, helping them to see how to connect what they're learning in school to things in the home life as well, especially things that are grabbing their interest. So empowering students to find their learning, empowering students to figure out what's out there for them can be an incredible tool for you as a parent. This gets back to that idea that when a student is interested in something, we want them to do the exploring. And if you can empower them then to find those opportunities, that's a tremendous tool for parents. The second tool is, these are a little bit more sort of hands-on activity type things. It's a tool we call the MythBusters. And this is something that we've used in classes. I've taught this for undergraduates. And the concept here is simple. It's you listen for facts and ideas in the media, and then you help your student to generate questions. So if your child's coming to you with something that they've heard or seen, you can really think about. So I've got some different pictures here. Many people know the Dory from Finding Nemo. And as someone who has historically studied memory and learning, I got a lot of questions when this movie came out about, does Dory really have a short-term memory problem? Well, it turns out Dory is a phenomenal example of mild amnesia. She is just really a truly classic example of what we consider a mild amnesia case. That's actually not a short-term memory problem. It actually means you only have short-term memory, but it's very, very well done. A beautifully crafted case that mirrors what we see in the clinical literature. That's the kind of thing that someone can look up. And so the idea is that you generate evidence, you generate questions, look up the evidence, and then decide. So using an example that was very popular with kids that I was working with, these were 12-year-olds when I was doing a destination imagination team. This story came out about school start times and this statement that starting school too early is causing all kinds of problems. It's causing poor academic performance, poor attendance, higher rates of accidents. And these kids were very interested. So I said, well, let's look it up. And the great thing about this was they actually gave you a source. So that was very useful. And what they found in digging into the source is they could actually find out what were they using as evidence. Well, what they were using as evidence was the fact that we know that sleep is critical for learning. And then we know that sleep does some various things to you. So they then crafted a very simple model where they said, okay, what we're actually seeing is that a lack of sleep has adverse effects. All of us know this, right? We know that if you don't get enough sleep, your motor control is not as good, you're not as attentive, you're a higher chance of accidents and injuries. And it turns out that it also is associated with cognitive challenges in the short and long term. Well, we know that kids sleep on a different schedule, especially when you hit the preteen and teenage years, and that early starts are leading to a lack of sleep among our kids. So the leap that this story makes is then that an early start will have adverse effects. It's actually a really smooth claim. And they even use the right language of starting early is associated with as opposed to causes. So this was a case where we did a little myth busting, and it turns out that it was mostly true. There were some elements of it that weren't quite as tight, but in general, it was a way to do it. This took all of like 15 minutes. And the kids were still talking about it, weeks later about how they had figured this out. And once you get them started on this, it's something they can do on their own as well. You just have to encourage it. A third tool is something that we actually do on and off with kids frequently, especially I think of snow days. In the old days when we had snow days and they didn't go online, we'd come up with projects. But there are things that you can do all the time. They can be pretty simple. And this really comes down to, again, when a child expresses interest and you're trying to figure out how to foster it, what can you ask them to do? You can ask them to dig in. You can ask them to think about why they're asking the question they're asking and have them work through sort of what they want to do with that. And then encouraging them to organize that new knowledge into some sort of product. And product is intentionally in quotes here because depending on the age and motivation, these can vary quite a bit. It can be paper, it can be map, it can be models, it could be literally just allowing them to sort of present to you, giving you the information that they found. So some sources for that are things like there can be controversial issues. Like we had a lot of questions, we still get a lot of questions about why do people get so upset about some of the statues, especially we had this happening in our own city in Baltimore. Questions that come up when you're planning a trip, asking your child to help with planning a trip. Thinking about things that are happening in travel or weekend experiences. Why are we going to certain places and what are we doing there? There's all kinds of things you can put around that. My son once put together a presentation on Kazakhstan for me because I was going there for work. And I have to admit, his presentation was a bit more informative than the briefing I got from my own really stellar team at CTY because he was so interested. He was fascinated. It can also be topics in schools. So I once had a neighbor who was telling me that they had heard that birds build different kinds of nests today, but she was having trouble articulating it. So her mom actually gave her some clay and she started building different kinds of nests and in doing so was explaining it to us, which I learned more than ever about nests. So projects can be very simple. They can be more complicated, really depending on the time, the interest, and sort of the particular content you're talking about. But it's deliberate rather than just, oh, my kid likes to do this. It's actually a deliberate way of again, this fosters that curiosity and keeps them engaged. The fourth tool is similar and a little more for the can't be the faint at heart. This is the tough stuff. No, it's not hard to do. Just can get very messy. These are home experiments. There are many kits and clubs for doing home experiments. I used to have a whole bunch of websites listed when I talked about this. Now it turns out just a very simple search will get you a host of interesting ideas that you can sort of decide. And again, this is one of those places where kids will often find these things themselves. If you've got someone who's interested in a particular topic, this can be a great way for them to find fun things to do. Again, this used to be for me when my son was young. It was like snow days. What am I going to do with these kids? It can also be very much curiosity driven. So I'm going to show an example. Actually, these are a couple of the same kids that did the myth busting. When they were a little bit younger, they were asking questions about what makes things float. And in doing so, we started talking about, well, what kinds of things float and what properties do they seem to have in common? Are they waterproof? And in doing that, the kids really wanted to just try some things out. So they started talking about shape and size. And so we let them set up a little experiment. And I'm going to show you the example of the experiment where they had the same material, but made two different shapes. And they added to it that sometimes when you drop things in water, the water splashes out. So they also wanted to look at the water levels. So they set up an experiment starting with 2 balls of clay that were roughly the same size, but made 2 different shapes, and then took 2 very full bowls of water and put their shapes in the water. And so you can see the first one just sank right away. Clay of the same size and weight, shaped more like what? A boat, and it floats. So they were able to play around with this, and they did some other things too. You can see in the background, there's a little stress ball made of foam and some other clay. There were a couple other things around there. And then they actually measured how much water dropped out of the bowl. So they could understand something about how the pieces were causing the water to splash out. So very, very simple. And actually, because it was water, it was not too messy. Peeps in the microwave is a whole nother story, but do not recommend that one unless it's not your microwave. So again, very simple curiosity-driven experiments, things you can do at home. And these can be very low-key, very simple. They don't require, again, do not require expertise, often do not require much in the way of resources either. So, and they're things that once you get kids started, they can kind of do on their own, which is very exciting to see happen. And then the last tool that I want to talk about, and this one could, this is another topic where I've done whole seminars on, is a really simple one that I think deep down we probably have been over the years skeptical about its role in learning, and then realized that no, it's a very powerful tool, and that is the simple act of play. We need to encourage our kids to play. We often focus so heavily on school, especially as they age up. But there's so much power in letting them have that sort of time that doesn't have that same flavor of school. Particularly, we think of that a lot in some of our CTY spaces where it's very rigorous, but it's very fun. School is often fun as well, but it's a different structure. So finding experiences that scaffold and reinforce learning can be as simple as just really, looking at the content of the things that kids are playing with. So at younger ages, we're often talking about the kinds of games they play, puzzles. These all extend upward. We encourage a lot of block play. I have a series of studies on the role of block play. And then just everyday objects, letting kids build and play with things. We were laughing about the fact that we spend so much time on our phones that we forget things like as simple as a big cardboard box can be a lot of fun. So really figuring out kind of like how to give them places and things to do. This can also include things on computers, meaning that there are a whole host of ways that you can leverage computer games and computer communities for this kind of play and learning as well. It just, again, has to be deliberate and thoughtful, and not a heavy lift, but just paying attention. And the key here is making choices based on both interest and difficulty. So in some of our previous work where we talk about characterizing these individuals, when we talk about characterizing our ability to learn, you really need to think about the difficulty level. If things are too easy, there's not as much learning going on. If things are too hard, there's not a lot of learning. So you've got to find that nice area where the material has sufficient challenge to keep a child interested. And play is like that as well. Now, what's interesting about play is that they will often lose interest if it's not challenging on some level. There are personalities where the easiest thing to do is also the most fun on the surface. But often when you push them into things that maybe are a little more difficult, you actually can see them thrive and sort of bloom in that situation. And the other thing I would say is that for parents, join the fun. So if you're a caregiver, if you're a teacher and you're working, teachers know this, they do get into this stuff. Join the fun, because play is actually good for all of us. We tend to think of play as something for our children, but really, it's good for the brain. It's good for longevity. It's got good mental health benefits. So getting involved with it as well is never a bad thing. Key there is just, often the time. And so figuring out how to do this in small scales is often where we need to go. So that is the set of tools. So just to recap, I've given you 5 tips. These are kind of the general things to be thinking about with some hands-on stuff. And then the tools, this is a subset of the things. And as I said before, each of these we could elaborate on and perhaps will in future webinars for you. But hopefully this provides you with just some things that, for me, like I said, they started out as a little bit of common sense in some ways, but really understanding why and how and being deliberate about it really helped a lot in thinking about how we serve our students. And as a parent myself, thinking about how I work with my own child as he was growing. So a few take-home messages alongside that I hope will sit well with you is that student success actually starts with being interested and engaged. And that's, we know that the engagement is really what keeps them going. An under-challenged student, it's hard to be engaged when you're not challenged. There are multiple ways to encourage learning that are outside of the school realm. The data show that we're doing more learning outside of school than in school. And that's not because schools aren't good for learning. It's just because we spend more time outside of school and in different environments. And so really talking about just ways to leverage that. And hopefully what you see is that tools can just be very simple everyday activities. They can be simple, they can be short, and they can be driven by your child. You just have to add a little direction and encouragement to get there. And so, as I said, I could talk about this all night. This is really fun stuff for us, and hopefully a little bit of utility for you in working with your own children. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Stacy to help manage the Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Amy. Let me go ahead and stop our recording.